You might be wondering how the economy goes from one long-run equilibrium to another in the dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model that we've learned so far. Here's a quick discussion of how we get from one place to another in response to a change in the rate of money growth. So first, we draw a graph. On the x-axis, we have the economy's real economic growth rate. On the y-axis, we have the inflation rate. Now, it's important to remember these are growth rates, not levels. So when we're talking about the inflation rate, this is the percentage increase in the price level from year to year. When we talk about the economic growth rate, it's the percentage increase in real GDP from year to year. The economy's long-run potential, given by its long-run aggregate supply curve, is going to be determined by technology, factors of production, and institutions. So what is the technology with which the economy is working? How much physical capital, human capital, labor, etc. do they have? And then what are the institutional constraints that are either encouraging people to produce or preventing them from producing? To use the numbers in the book, the real GDP growth rate has been about 3% for a very, very long time. So the book goes with 3%, and that's what we'll use here. Now you also have the aggregate demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve is given by the quantity theory of money. We assume, just to keep things simple, that the velocity of money is not changing. So the aggregate demand curve is going to be all combinations of the inflation rate and the real economic growth rate that add up to the growth rate in the money supply. So, if the money supply is growing at 5% per year, and the economy's long-run potential growth is 3% per year, then inflation is going to be 2% per year. Now here's why this is interesting. There are basically two different ways that spending can grow from year to year. We can either have more dollars to spend, or we can spend a fixed quantity of dollars more frequently. We're going to assume, again, that the velocity of money, the frequency with which we spend dollars, doesn't change. So what's going to change nominal spending here is going to be a change in the rate of money growth. What we want to know now is, of that increase in spending, how much of it is due to prices rising, and how much of it is due to increases in real output. In the long run, money is neutral. This means that any increase in the money supply is only going to change the inflation rate. In the short run, however, because prices and wages are sticky, a change in aggregate demand, a change in the growth rate of the money supply, can actually have effects. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is a world where prices are sticky and what matters for our visualization of the short-run aggregate supply curve is people's expectations about inflation. Here, we're in long-run equilibrium because expected inflation matches actual inflation, and the economy is at its long-run growth potential. Now what I want to do is see what happens when there's a shock to aggregate demand. So let's suppose that there's an increase in the growth rate of the money supply. This is going to increase aggregate demand. So let's suppose that the growth rate in the money supply increases to 7% per year. Now, the amount of money in the economy is growing. Meanwhile, people are expecting inflation to only be 2% per year. They're seeing people ordering more stuff, they're seeing people spending more money, so they say, oh look, people are buying more of our stuff, let's expand output. Get a short-run burst in real GDP growth, prices are increasing, but eventually, though, people come to update their expectations. They come to update their expectations and recognize, well, no, we're not actually producing more stuff. Rather, it's just that we have more money to spend. Everybody's going to be ordering more supplies and stuff like that. That's going to put upward pressure on prices. People will adjust their expectations about inflation. And the economy is going to return to its long-run growth rate, albeit here with a higher rate of inflation. And the same long-run GDP growth. So here's what happens. 1. We increase the rate of growth in the money supply. So we print more money, or the money supply grows more rapidly. This increases aggregate demand. 2. In response to this increase in aggregate demand, prices start rising a little bit more rapidly. Output starts growing a little bit more rapidly. Because prices are sticky, we get a bit of short-run growth. Well, a small increase in short-run growth. Over time, however, people adjust their expectations. Expectations adjust. And the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts. So we go from one long-run equilibrium, in this case, with a real economic growth rate of 3% and an inflation rate of 2%, to another long-run equilibrium with a real growth rate of 3% and an inflation rate of 4%. That's basically how an economy adjusts from one long-run equilibrium to another, in this case, in response to an increase in aggregate demand stemming from an increase in the growth rate of the money supply. Now, what you should do next is, after you've worked all this out and figured it out, see if you can make it work for aggregate demand moving in the opposite direction. Reduce the growth rate of the money supply, follow these steps, and see what happens as we move, again, from one long-run equilibrium to another.